Ecclesiastes 3:1 says this: to everything there is a season and a time for everyone. And I was thinking that as an organization, Potential Church, and I've kind of been praying about this. I think that that we are going into what you would call, if we're going to try to think about the four seasons, I think we're going into what I would call like a spring season. Okay. I think that we're going into a spring season, a spring season. All right. Now, I'm going to walk through some things that we see in the climate, spring. And when I say we're going into spring, it could get confusing because we are going into spring. But I'm not just saying we're going into spring, the climate. I'm saying we're going into spring as an organization, which might mean we've been in winter, all right? And not just for the last couple of months, but maybe for the last, well, since COVID, right? COVID kind of brought on a winter. So if we think about some of these things, all right? First of all, there's an excitement for the new, right? Spring always brings us, right? New green grass and flowers, right? Spring brings us in. Now, here's what you notice in the physical spring. You go out and you're like, man, look at those flowers. It's so, and again, I know we live in South Florida, so maybe you have to think about it in a book, all right, or a movie or something to that. But you go out and you see the flowers, you see the trees, oh, that's beautiful. Here's what you don't do. You don't say, well, they're just going to die again this winter, right? You don't have that sense of cynicism. Right? But here's the reason I'm sharing that is because when it comes to ministry, sometimes we can get there, right? We can get there to where somebody say, oh, look at the pretty green tree. And you're like, yeah, but you know what? It's just going to be dead again in 6 months, we don't do that every year, even though, right, there is a circular aspect to the seasons. The moment we see a pretty tree or the green grass or the nice flowers, we don't just say, well, it's just going to die again in the winter. There's the excitement overrides the negativity or that kind of cynicism. What a weird word, right? All right. The transition, if you think about it, is pretty radical. Not here, but in most places, right? We grew up in Arkansas. I was born in Michigan. You can go to many other places in the country. And if you think of, and when I say radical, what I mean is it affects the temperatures. It goes from being 28 to being 78, eventually to in the low 80s, and then it turns into summer. That's a pretty radical. You get 30 or 40 degrees. Also, the colors. If you were to go to New York today, or you were to go to Arkansas or Tennessee or the Carolinas, you're going to see brown, you're going to see dead, you're going to see ugly everywhere that you look. And if you go back at the end of March, you're going to see flowers and leaves and greenery. I mean, it's a drastic change. You're also going to see things that are dead come alive, which is pretty drastic. Even the clothing that people wear. From wearing dark and boots and coats to wearing shorts and t-shirts. So I just want you to think, because again, I think we can learn something from the seasons when we think about the seasons that we go through. That doesn't mean that something's wrong. It means that there may be some storms. That's why there are storms in the spring, right? Because cold air masses hit warm air masses and they create storms. And in times of transition, as you transition from one season to the next season, there are going to be seasons where it feels rough. It doesn't feel as smooth as we'd like for it to be. Also, when you think about the spring, there's growth, but there's also planting. Right? In other words, the trees and the grass and the flowers are growing, but the farmers are planting. So both are going on at the same time. So as we think about going into a spring season as an organization, we're going to see, right? We're thinking about whether it be the Spanish service or Wednesday or the folks who are trusting Christ or the school, right? Those are things that we're going to see flower, but there's also things that we're planting for the future. When you think about the university, we're planting. It may be multiple years before we actually see all the impact that it can have. It's going to be several years before we get all the way to the 12th grade, before we get all the way to the 12th grade in Pensacola, before our Pensacola campus gets up and running, right? All those things are going to take time. So we're planting into those, but that doesn't mean that we're not also at the same time seeing things turn green. And it's important to know that if you don't do both, you won't have a harvest. If you get caught up in the flowers today, you won't have any corn in October. So you have to do both. Also, there's some mourning for what died in the winter. In the spring, there's mourning over what died in the winter. A lot of times, honeybees won't make it through the winter. If their hive gets invaded by beetles or it gets too cold, that hive will just die out. There are certain plants who die in the winter. Did you know that around the world, more people die in the winter than any other season? Even in warm climates. So it's not got anything to do with cold weather, but there's something about the winter that science doesn't really know what it is. But in the U.S., it's like 12% more people die in the winter than any other season. So congratulations, you've almost made it, okay? Hopefully you survive another month or two. And I think the same thing is true organizationally. There are certain things that don't make it through the winter. And anytime something doesn't survive, even if grandma is 95 years old, we still mourn her loss or his loss, right? Grandpa, right? Or if you travel and that business you used to go to when you were a kid goes out of business or closes its doors or even maybe changes its name. There's a natural mourning that takes place at what has died in the winter. And I think the same thing is true organizationally. There's certain things that do not survive difficult times. And it's often not because something wasn't done correctly. It's what the winter does. Right? There are certain things that die in the winter because they're supposed to die in the winter so that they can give birth to something new in the spring. In order to plant in the spring, if you were to go to Tennessee or Arkansas, they have to till the ground. And in order to till the ground, they're turning over the ground. And that means that the corn and some of the other crops that have been harvested have to be turned under. Or sometimes like wheat fields, I think, and other fields, they'll actually burn, right? So in order to have a harvest in the fall, they have to plow so that they can plant. And I think that the same thing is true when it comes to organizations. Is there are some things, as we talked last week, that have to be plowed under so that the soil can give new birth into the future. And that, as we're going to see, is what makes seasons difficult. Also, in the spring, you've got flowers blooming and trees growing, and you're putting seeds into the ground that are going to produce, wheat or whatever in the fall. You also have to water the plants that take years to grow. I was looking it up, and there are some plants that take 3 years. You put the bulb into the ground, and it doesn't produce a flower for 3 years. So I think it's important because I do think that every organization goes through these seasons. And I don't know that they last a certain amount of time. Here in the United States, you can kind of figure out summer is this long and fall is this long and spring is this long and winter, and it kind of stays in there. I don't think life is that way. You can somewhere maybe be, whether you're in the springtime of your life or the fall, but within the big context, there's also the small context, right? You're beginning something, something's changing, all of those kind of things. And I think it's true as you think about a potential church or you think about your ministry. And this is what I put: every season demands change. Now we know that, but we don't like that. All right. One of the most important things is to be able to lead through change, not hinder change or keep things from changing. Um, Organizational seasons are always difficult to lead through because, as a group, we don't like change. Tyler said it: growth demands change. All right. Now they don't all have to be seismic changes, where the ground shifts underneath us. This is what I wrote down. Most people think they embrace change. Like, you might be sitting there and you're saying, I don't need to hear this. I love change. Most people think that. Most people think they embrace change. But here's reality, including us. Most people embrace the change they initiate. And as a result, they think they like change. Right? There was and you see it in churches, right? People who loved bus ministry back in the day talked about how we got to change, right? The transportation's changing, this is changing. And then the music changed. You went from the hymns to, all these choruses and stuff. And people would say, well, we need to play stylistically similar music in the church that people hear on the radio. But the people who were saying that like the songs that were on the radio. In other words, it's easy to make a change that you're initiating. If you like the music we're changing to, by golly, we need to make that change. If you like the times we're changing to, it's like, we need to make that change, right? So we have to almost step back and really look into the mirror and ask ourselves, how do I deal with change in my personal life, in my financial life, in my family life, in my ministry life? Because if we don't do change well, we won't succeed. And you know how, again, it's just like I shared a moment ago. We know we don't like change because anytime change happens, most people assume the worst. Right? No matter we change the times, people are going to assume the worst, right? You change Iris and Derek leaving. Well, something must have happened. Somebody must have said something. We're closing the campus in Lima. Well, what's happened? Well, there's nothing that has changed in a negative sense in the last few years there. It's just, right? So I say all that to say it's important to evaluate where you are with change. Because you and some people are maybe embrace change easier than other folks, but all of us can be resistant to change. I mean, maybe when it comes to music styles, you're easy to change, but when it comes to other things, you're like, and the reason it's so difficult to see is because we couch the change we don't like off, if we're Christians, in spiritual terms. Right. Well, I don't think God would like that, or I don't think that's as spiritual, or I don't think that, right? All those kind of things to kind of hide the fact that in reality, we just don't want change because the skin doesn't like to change. Have you heard all your life as people get older, that stay off my lawn kind of thing? Where does that come from? It just comes from people not wanting to change. And now you're trying to change me. You're trying to change my neighborhood. You're trying to change my cable. You're trying to change my whatever it is, right? It's like if you go now to some people's homes, they're still going to have VCRs, right? Why would somebody still have a VCR, right? It's, well, because they know how to operate VCR. They don't know how to do Netflix, right? There's no other reason to not embrace where we're going. But others drag their feet to stay in the past. Some people are quick to embrace technology, but in other areas, they tend to drag their feet. So I want us to look where Jesus addresses this directly, all right? Now, he's going to direct it in the context between the law and grace, between, the Ten Commandments and the New Covenant, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But I think the principles that he gives us apply to what we're talking about today. It's found in a couple of places, but we're going to look in Luke chapter 5, just a couple of verses here. But I think we can really learn some things. And here's my prayer for me as I went through this, asking myself this question and really challenging you. Because as someone who may change and one day get married, or change one day and go to school, or change one day and have children, or change one day and those children grow up, or change one day, whatever that change is, these things are important because sadly, they're not natural. And what I mean by that is I can't keep spring from coming. I can deny it, right? But so much change we do try to resist. So look at what Jesus says, starting in verse 33. He says, one day some people said to Jesus, John the Baptist's disciples fast and pray regularly, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. Why are your disciples always eating and drinking? And Jesus responded, do wedding guests fast while celebration with the groom? Of course not. But someday a groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Then Jesus gave him this illustration. So what he's about to say has to do with what he's already said. Then Jesus gave him this illustration. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and uses it to patch an old garment. For the new garment would be ruined, and the new patch wouldn't even match the old garment. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the new wine would burst the wineskins, spilling the wine and ruining the skins. New wine must be stored in new wineskins. But no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine. The old is just fine, they say. So let me give you a few thoughts about this. The first one is this. In those first few verses, they're talking about fasting, and Jesus basically says, while you're at the wedding, you don't fast. But after the wedding, you fast. In other words, he's saying, while I'm here, that's why they don't fast. But here's the way I wrote it down. Change is always changing. In other words, change is never final. And because we don't like change, you know what most of us do? We drag our feet or maybe even initiate ourselves into a change thinking, now we've changed, we don't need to change anymore. In other words, people get mad when you change something that then you change. Have you noticed that? It's like, oh my gosh, we never know what we're going to do because you're always changing something. And Jesus says right here, he says, you know what? We have changed because of the environment, the circumstances. I'm here, so they're not fasting, but I'm not always going to be here. And when I'm not here, they will fast. In other words, we have changed from the normal, but we're not going to stay here. We're going to change again. And it's important to be reminded of that because there's a lot of sense. We're going to change the time, then we're going to always have that time, right? Or we're going to what did they call it? I forgot what they called laying people off, where they outward promoted them at Facebook. All right, right. We're going to outwardly promote the congregation in Lima, in the sense that we're going to send them, you might say, as missionaries to hopefully take what we've given them out into other churches. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a campus there in the future, right? I don't know what the circumstances hold. That doesn't mean we make changes without thought or without thinking. But what I'm saying is there is this tendency for us to make a change, for you to make a change, and then everybody make the assumption that now that change is never going to change. And Jesus says right here, and he's talking about change. And he says right here, he says, look, this is what we're doing for now. But when the circumstances change, we're going to change. And I just remind us to keep our mind there. Again, we want to do what we need to do to make the right changes at the right time in the right way. We don't want to just be flippant with changes, but we want to go into a change knowing that if the circumstances change, we're going to change. And if you don't, you'll drag your feet. And you'll be frustrated, and then you'll frustrate the folks around you. And then you'll start to doubt whether or not we're even going in the right direction, because if we change something that we're now changing again, then do they know what they're doing, or are we going in the right direction? That could be the case, but Jesus did it, and I think he knew what he was doing. All right? And he even called it out beforehand. He warned them, because they're saying, why have you changed things? Why are your disciples not fat? Why are you doing it different? And Jesus says, well, we're doing it different now, but we're also going to do it different from the way we're doing it. Right? Our different is going to be different into the future. The next thing that I noticed, that he talks about the patch, right? Putting a new patch on an old pair of clothes. Our first temptation is to try and patch what we're leading. Our first temptation is to try to patch what is not going in the right direction. And the reason, I think, is because it's easier and more comfortable and takes less energy than it does to start something new. Right? It's easier to cut a piece of cloth from a new pair of jeans and put it over the knees of an old pair of jeans than it is to find a pattern and get the denim and cut a new pattern and sew it and put the rivets and do all the things to create a new pair of jeans. That's just a lot more demanding. It takes a lot more energy. And so I need to be reminded that my first temptation, it doesn't mean, that everything has to be reborn and redreamed, but it's important for me to be reminded I'm going to always be tempted to do that which is easier and takes less energy. That something new has new demands. Right? It's kind of like the battle you see going on right now politically for this U.S. aid between Elon and the establishment. Because, what's Elon saying? Tear it all down. Right? We can start over. And what do you even see President Trump and some of the others saying? Well, can't we just patch it? Can't we just stop? And I'm not saying which one is the right one to do. What I'm saying is the temptation. So if I realize it's a temptation, I can make a better decision of what I need to do moving forward. But Jesus is just reminding us that when you take something new and you try to attach it to something old, that it doesn't work. Right? And I think, well, why is that? What's this? It's so much fun to watch this battle. And the reason is because Elon sees something that doesn't work while others see their legacy. Right? It's like, I remember when we bought those jeans. I remember where we were. They got so much meaning to me. And Elon just sees a pair of jeans with a big hole in the knee. So he's like, we need to fix the hole. And the other's like, well, can't we just put a patch over it and still have the jeans so I can show my grandkids the jeans and tell them about the journey and all of those kind of things. And Elon's saying, but they got a hole in them, right? We just need some new jeans. Churches die all the time because they're wearing holy jeans. And I don't mean holy in a spiritual sense. I mean, they got a big hole in the knee. But they're afraid to do something new. And notice what Jesus says. At first here's the reason it's tempting. At first it seems less painful to put on a patch. But then what did Jesus say? He says it destroys both of them. Right? Both look what he says. He says, Jesus responded about the wedding guest, and he says he gave him the illustration. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and uses it to patch an old garment, for the new garment would be ruined and the new patch wouldn't even match the old garment. So it doesn't fix the problem, and it ruins the opportunity to do something new. Right? Because the money is limited, or the resources are limited, or whatever it is. So just know that the first temptation is going to be to try and do a patch. Here's the third thing, because then he goes into the wine. New wine has to ferment or expand. Okay? Why does the new wine have to go into new wineskins? Because new wine is not yet fermented and it's going to ferment some inside the wineskin. And if the wineskin is brittle, it's not going to give room for it to expand, and it's just going to open up and crack and break. So new wine has to have room to expand. Now that sounds good, but let's think about what that means, because you may have heard, you may have even said things like, we don't do it that way. Right? Well, what is that? We don't do it that way. It's basically saying, I'm not going to give room for that to expand because we don't know how it's going to turn out. It's scary. Change is scary. You know what you're doing when you're doing it, but you don't know what's going on with what you haven't done. And so that fear often keeps us doing what? Let's just use the old wine. We know how it operates. We know what it tastes like. We know what we're doing. Right? But new wine, that's not the way we do that. And again, I'm not saying there's never any rules of thumb or anything like that. But what I am saying is I promise you, whether it be your children, whether it be the spouse that you marry, or whether it be the ministry that you lead, your first response to new wine is going to be to try to make it operate like old wine. And it hasn't fermented yet. And as a result, it needs room to expand. It needs room to grow. What determines the age of a wine skin is how brittle it is. Right? So it's not just how old is it, but it's how brittle it is. In other words, a wine skin that's been around for a while, but has been continued to be taken care of so as to be flexible, can still handle new wine. It's not about the age of the wineskin. It's about how brittle is the wineskin. Has it been conditioned? Does it have conditioner on it? And that's an intentional thing you have to do, because wineskins don't naturally stay flexible. They naturally become brittle. You put new wine into it, it expands when it ferments, and it causes a mess. Where new wineskin is naturally flexible because it's new. So how do we condition ourselves so as not to become brittle? So that we can be a part of the new. Because if not, you're part, you don't get to be a part of the next thing God's doing, the new things God's doing. That's why today the Jewish people, right, they don't know Jesus. They're still waiting on the Messiah. How? Why? Because that's who he's talking about here. He's saying basically, you guys haven't given any room for the new covenant. You haven't given any room for Jesus. And so you have a whole nation of people that are still waiting for something to happen that's already happened because they weren't conditioned. They became brittle and they didn't have room. So how do we stay conditioned? You have to be intentional about this. And the things that I wrote down, you can think about it yourself, but is growth. You got to continue to grow, because if you're growing, you're expanding yourself. You're staying flexible, right? You're moving beyond your comfort zone. That's what real growth does. Real growth is not just new knowledge, but real growth is knowledge that brings about change or transformation. In other words, I've learned something, so I'm going to try something new. I'm going to do it in a different way. And that you got to become comfortably uncomfortable. If not, you will become brittle. Right? And why? It's easy. It's like some of us can drive home without ever thinking about going home, because you go home the same way every time. You never take a new route, or we put on our GPS, don't we? And we never engage our mind. Why? It's easier. Why in the world just take off driving? If I live, let's say, north, why? And I want to get home going south first, right? That's going to take a lot more energy. It's going to take a lot more, but it's those kind of things, right? It's this intentionality to say, I'm going to not just learn something new, but I'm going to then apply that in a new way. And why is that hard? Because the moment you begin to apply it, everybody that doesn't like change is going to push against you. If I take you with me to my house and I leave Sterling Road and I turn right, every one of you are going to say, what are you doing? Why are you going that way? Right? And if I don't have an answer that, well, I'm going to go to Starbucks, or, right, there's immediately pushback. Now, maybe it's a prettier route, Maybe we're going to see the alligator. I don't know, right? But, and it's not, and why are you? Because you think you know how to get there, because you've gone there before in a certain way, and you're going to call it out, and I'm going to feel inferior, right? And so next time, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to turn left. And that happens in ministries and organizations and in families all the time, because it is so uncomfortable to go right and have to explain why. So you got to condition yourself to stay flexible, and that means applying your learning. Secondly, that means you got to be patient, right? You got to, fermentation doesn't happen in a matter of minutes. And so you've got to give time for people to expand, to grow, to become good wine, you might say. And patience is not something that's easy, right? That's why, again, as ministries get older, they get older, because they tend to hire people who are what? Older. Because if you hire somebody who's either younger physically or younger in the ministry than you, they're going to need fermentation. And fermentation is frustrating when you can just go out here and hire somebody that knows everything you know. Maybe they know more than you know. And again, I'm not saying you hire people who don't know anything, but again, new demands that we leave room. So if we're going to leave room, it's not totally developed yet. You're going to be most comfortable with wine that's the same age as you are. And so we have to be intentional, right? And again, please hear me on this. We all think we're doing it, and yet in the United States, even if you think about here and you look around, it is so natural to naturally become older. One is because none of us ever think we get old, and yet we all do, right? And so we have to intentionally engage the wisdom of the established wine, and we have to give room for the new wine. And this is probably the most difficult one, right? There's growth in the sense of applying it. There's patience, but then there's humility. Humility. Again, this is a hard one, isn't it? Because we all think we're humble. I mean, there's nobody anywhere within the sound of my voice, including myself, that thinks they're arrogant. And so, but humility is so necessary in order to stay conditioned so as to be a part of the new wine. In other words, you got to be humble enough to admit you don't know everything. Now, none of us would say we know everything, but we operate as we do know everything. Right? And so one of the biggest challenges in leadership is trying to work through wisdom, right? What's the wise thing to do? And yet how, at the same time, do I leave room for new wine? And so I put it like this too. You're thinking empowerment over control. Which do you value the most? Right? Is that because if control is easier, that's why, China has a dictator. And, they don't have to worry about what the media thinks or what the people think, or they can just do. And that's why dictatorships that are ran by benevolent people often do well in the world, because you got somebody who wants the best for the country and has the power in which to do it. Okay. But our founding fathers said, which the Bible agrees with, is we're not that trustworthy as people, right? We all have skin. And so we need this around us to keep us from doing bad stuff like Hitler and Mao and Castro and all these other folks. But if you think about your leadership, right, which do you value the most? Are you looking for opportunities to empower, knowing it's going to demand that you be flexible? Why? Because you're going to have to give more time, right? You're going to have to walk with that person as they ferment. It means they're going to make some mistakes along the way that you're going to have to fix, because you can't let the organization die, right? You can't, that's not a win if everything, so it just takes a lot greater effort. It's just easier to say, no, this is the way we do it. That means you do it that way. right? And it's knowing how to hear how much empowerment are you going to give and who are you going to give it to, and how much a part are you going to make yourself as a part of that empowerment. Because, if I just say, you know what, Nick, and then I come over here and I completely empower him, but I also make sure everybody knows I'm not a part of what I've empowered him to do. So if he fails, it's because he's an idiot. All right. And it's not because, right, as opposed to empowering him, but making myself available to him and letting everybody know I'm with him, risking my reputation, you know what I mean, on his empowerment. Now, as the one who, if you have somebody in your life that does that, it's important that you honor them, because you need to realize that they are risking their everything that they've, put effort into. Because if they've connected themselves with you and then you do something crazy, it's going to impact them in a big way. Um, but you have to be choosing. So new wine has to ferment, it has to expand, and you have to decide whether you're going to condition yourself to allow it. Or are you just going to become the kind of person that has to have the kind of wine that fits its brittleness? Or it's, I'm going to stay in the game, but I can only partner with this kind of person, right? And there's just two more here, is the realization that any church or family or business are destroyed by an unwillingness to change, right? Because remember what he said? He said that you put new wine into old wineskins, it does what? It destroys both the wine and the wineskin, the new and the old genes. And how many times have we seen that at churches, right? Where they try to put wine into old wineskins and the church divides and everybody gets mad. And at the end of the day, everybody gets hurt. And I think it's important for us to realize that they killed Jesus in an effort to do what? Protect the old. They're like, no, this is no, no, this is not, he's not the one. This is not the way that we do it. Now, God is bigger, right? Even though we might make decisions that hurt or destroy the wine and the wineskins, God's got a bit, he's bigger than any mistake we can make. And so, Jesus or God ultimately had a plan in all that the Jews were going to do. But it's realizing that that's important. Families get destroyed because moms can't let go of their kids, right? I mean, you guys all deal with that kind of thing. Their children have never spent the night away from them, right? They've never empowered, and then they go off to college and they do weird stuff because they've never had the ability to make decisions while they were at home. And that's hard. And again, that doesn't mean that those parents who are trying to control, their son or daughter, even though they're married, are bad. It just means, right, that they're not humble, right? They're not, they're worried that they're, going to mess it up, or they get their value from that person. And it's destructive. It's destructive to that how many sons and daughters have gotten divorced because of mom or dad and the decisions that mom and dad made, right? And it's just it's a lot more destructive than we realize. That means, and knowing, again, remember, what's the thing? I'm going to tend to become brittle if I'm not intentionally conditioning myself. As a leader, as a father, as a husband, as a person, as a church, I'm going to continue. The natural is to become brittle. Seasons demand change. Change is not easy, especially the kind of change that brings growth, new wine, new genes. And then lastly is that, let me make sure I'm not, lastly, humility is a decision. Right? Humility is a decision. New wine has to be embraced before it becomes wine. right? In other words, it's not fermented yet. So you have to then humbly empower someone who is not yet what you desire for them to be. New wine has to be embraced before it expands, you might think. So when it gets poured in, it doesn't take up the space. But as it grows, it has the space to become what it was meant to be. Does your family, does your ministry, does your leadership have the room for the people around you to become what God intended for them to be? Or does your leadership limit that? Now, I remember, and I'm not saying, some people think that they're empowering when really they're just an aloof, right? They're totally disconnected, right? I'm not empowered if I don't think you care about what I'm doing, if you're not engaged in what I'm doing. So there's that because really, I'm still a wineskin. It's not, I'm still there, right? I'm giving some kind of direction. I'm giving some kind of input. I'm just that I'm giving room for the expansion to take place. And it's a choice to humble myself that way, right? And because you've had success in the past, right? You're a wineskin, right? Then there's a tendency for us to become arrogant. And if you're new wine, remember that formation takes time, right? You don't get in too big of a hurry yourself. And you notice how Jesus ends it. He says, but no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine or desire the new wine, because the old wine tastes just fine. In other words, it's so easy to become content. One of the things when I speak on parenting, I always try to get parents of young kids to realize their ultimate goal is for that child to become an adult, right? That's the ultimate goal. But it's hard to embrace that when what you're doing feels so good. You've heard me say, your kids are going to think about you the way you think about your parents. And I'm not, I'm assuming you have a good relationship with your parents, okay? Like I love my mom, but I don't think of my mom as part of my family. She's part of my family, but she's, right? In other words, when our kids were little, it was me and Steph and Tyler and Carson and Bailey. And then there was mom and there was dad and there was her mom and her dad, and but it was us, right? And I've always felt like, while your kids, are a part of that family, your vision is their vision. We're running after together. And then one day it hit me that as they grow up, they're going to think about me in the same way, in the sense they're not going to think about me all the time. And when they think about their family, they're not necessarily going to think about me. They're going to think about me when they think about, well, I don't know. All right. And I don't say that in a negative sense, but that's a change that a lot of families are not ready for. And as a result, they don't give room, right, for that expansion of ideas or mindset or whatever it is. And we can all fall into that. We're all tempted to do that. And you're tempted to do that in your ministry. We're at such an exciting time in the history of the world. I mean, all this new technology, what might be and could be. And we're in South Florida. We're not, it's great if you're in Podunk, wherever, but we're not. We're here where there's opportunity for influence if we figure it out. The world comes here for vacation. Celebrities come here. Those who point the world in certain directions. I mean, what a cool opportunity. But it takes new wine. And it's not just doing old wine better. And with that comes a risk. And some new wine's kind of like new Coke. Some of it doesn't taste very good. But what an opportunity you have. We have. Potential Church has. The question is, are we going to humble ourselves and embrace it and go into the spring
with a great sense of excitement and passion.
And fear that drives us to have faith so as to trust God.